Hello viewers and welcome to another episode of Elections by Numbers. Today we're talking about the Evergreen State, Washington. Washington is the only state that is named after a US president and is the home state for the two, not one, but two richest men in the world. Both Jeff Bezos, the founder of Amazon, and Bill Gates, the founder of Microsoft, have homes in the town of Medina, Washington, so the mean income of that town is probably a little wacky. The state is also the site where many great bands emerged during the early 90s during the grunge movement, including Soundgarden, Pearl Jam, the Melvins, Nirvana, and Alice in Chains. And to this day, the music scene in Washington, specifically Seattle, is particularly formidable. Washington has 10 congressional House districts, and the current balance of power is 7 Democrats to 3 Republicans. Only one district actually flipped 2 years ago during the most recent midterm cycle, and that was Washington's 8th district, which has a Cook Political Report partisan voting index lean of 0, so it represents the national average. Washington's 8th is one district that I would consider to be competitive again this year, as well as Washington's 3rd district, which was won by its Republican incumbent 2 years ago, but by only about a 5% margin, which is had decreased from about a 27% margin of victory in 2016. So certainly Democratic strength has increased dramatically in the district. Let's also consider that its partisan voting index lean is +4 into the Republican column. So Washington's 3rd and 8th are the two somewhat competitive districts this year. To figure out how Washingtonians vote for their representatives, let's pull up a line graph right now. And looking at this line graph, you'll see the regular ups and downs that coincide with presidential years versus midterm years from 2010 to 2016 anyway. Then of course 2018 was just a blowout in Democratic turnout, which is largely the reason why a competitive district, Washington's 3rd, went from a 27% margin of victory for the Republican to just a 5%. It is because turnout within the state as a whole actually saw more Democrats turning out for House candidates in 2018 than there were in 2016, which is nuts because you typically see higher turnout during presidential years, but that was clearly not the case in Washington 2 years ago. On the other hand, Republicans did return to expected midterm numbers in 2018, very similar to their numbers in 2014. Overall, this graph paints a very positive outlook for the Democratic Party of Washington. So let's toss that graph aside. And how I think Washington's 3rd and 8th are going to go down is I don't think either of them are going to flip this year. Certainly not Washington's 8th, which is the one that flipped 2 years ago to Democratic control. But Washington's 3rd district, I believe, may have seen peak performance 2 years ago. I don't know how much room there is to improve beyond their numbers from 2018, and they still fell about 5% short. Plus, the rating from Cook is +4 into the Republican column, so I do expect the Republican incumbent to narrowly hang on to that district. So at the end of the day, we have no House flips for the state of Washington. Let's make that official and put it on our first map. Mark it. Up next, we have a governor election in Washington. Democratic incumbent Jay Inslee is running for a 3rd 4-year term this year against Republican challenger Loren Culp, who is a police chief from the state of Washington. Little background on Inslee. His first term that he won as governor was in 2012, and he won that by just about 3% margin of victory, but then expanded that to about 9% when he ran a second time in 2016. How have residents of the state been voting for governors over the last decade? Let's pull up some voter turnout ratios right now. So looking at these numbers, you'll see that Jay Inslee's first run in 2012, he had a voter ratio under 100%, meaning that he received fewer votes than the total of all Democratic House candidates running in the state of Washington that year, and his Republican opponent received more votes than all the Republican House candidates running in the state that year. And an advantage on the Republican candidates' end is the reason that Jay Inslee narrowly won that year by just 3%. Fast forward 4 years, we see Jay Inslee's ratio improving and the Republican candidates getting worse, which accounts for his 9% victory that year and probably speaks to Washington residents' confidence in their governor as he became more experienced on the job. But anyway, let's toss those numbers aside and lastly consider the approval rating of the incumbent. In this case, it is Governor Inslee, and he is at +6 approval rating in the state, which is okay. It could be better, but it's not negative, and that's what matters. So now we have everything we need. Let's give all of our variables to Pollbot here to calculate if Inslee will win a 3rd term or we'll see Governor Loren Culp. Pollbot. And there you have it, Governor Inslee winning again by a 17.3% margin of the vote, improving even further upon his performance from 2016 by about another 8 percentage points. Probably helped a lot by the fact that our projected turnout for Democrats at the House level is pretty high. And I imagine a lot of those voters will be supporting their Democratic governor as well, as evidenced by the voter turnout ratios. So let's now make this official and put it on our gubernatorial map. Mark it. Now it is time to talk about the presidential election of 2020, starring President Donald Trump and Democratic challenger Joe Biden. Washington is a state that last voted for a Republican presidential candidate in 1984 when they voted to send Ronald Reagan to the White House a second time over Democratic challenger Walter Mondale. More recently, the state did vote for Hillary Clinton by about a 16% margin of the vote over President Trump. To learn more about how the state has been voting for presidential candidates in the past, let's pull up some more voter turnout ratios. And here we're looking at some numbers that, when compared across parties, actually are pretty abysmal for Republicans, and particularly for Donald Trump. Mitt Romney managed to get a 94% voter turnout ratio versus Obama's roughly 107%. And then in 2016, both candidates from both parties received lower ratios than either of their predecessors, but the difference is particularly stark, I think, for President Trump. Even though they both fell by about 7 to 8%, the difference is much more noticeable when your numbers are starting out below 100%. And couple the trajectory of these ratios with the knowledge that Democrats are likely to turn out in pretty large numbers at the House level, so this certainly is a grim outlook for President Trump going into November. So let's toss those numbers aside and lastly consider the approval rating of the incumbent, in this case President Trump. He is at negative 34 points in the state of Washington right now, which is pretty terrible. Nothing is working in the president's favor this time around. I mean, projected turnout is expected to be great for Democrats. He has a horrible turnout ratio that we projected, and that approval rating is just garbage. Sorry. But just for fun, let's give all those variables to Pollbot to see what we've projected for the two presidential candidates this year. Pollbot. And there you have it. Biden carrying the state by about a 22.02% margin of victory, which is significant. It's higher than Hillary Clinton enjoyed, but honestly, I expected it to actually be a little higher than this. I expect it to be above 25. Everything's just working in Democrats' favor this year. They have a relatively popular governor, Democratic governor, running for re-election. The Democratic Party has enthusiasm on their side this time around, and I expect Joe Biden to perform very well in the state. So let's make that official and put it on our presidential map right now. Mark it. So now all the election results are in for the state of Washington. We've seen no flips at the House level, really no flips anywhere. Lots of Democratic victories all around, minus those three Republican represented districts. Let's talk briefly about the future of the state by looking at an old line graph and two new ones. So first, let's take a bit of a closer look at the raw House turnout numbers over the last decade for both parties. Let's look specifically at those slope values that are available in both of those equations. For Democrats, it's that value preceding X, 128.3, and for Republicans, it's that value negative 13.7. So basically what those numbers tell us is when we look at the last decade as a whole, on average, every 2 years, Democrats have turned out 128,300 more votes for their candidates every 2 years. And the Republicans have actually been losing an average of 13,700 votes for their candidates every 2 years. It hasn't happened very often in this series so far, honestly, where we see a negative slope value for either party. And whenever that shows up, that's just really dismal news for the party with that negative slope value. In this case, Republicans, of course. Just drawing from this graph alone and those equations, I can surmise that Democrats are not really going to have any serious competition at the state level for a very long time in Washington. But let's also take a quick glance at those other two line graphs. First, these are estimates basically for those ratios that I was using earlier in my calculations. So the gubernatorial to House vote ratio here. Well, the Republicans have held a slight edge on those turnout ratios, but of course, those ratios are relative to raw House turnout numbers, which, as we just observed, greatly favor Democrats, especially going into the future. So a few percentage points difference in these ratios is certainly not going to be enough to help Republican gubernatorial candidates win any elections anytime soon. And then compounding on top of Democrats' advantage in House numbers is these presidential to House voter ratio estimates. They are both decreasing, both lines decreasing for both parties, and that's because the enthusiasm basically decreased going from Obama versus Romney to Clinton versus Trump. I expect the parties to maintain a difference of about this much going into this November and beyond that as well. So let's toss all those graphs aside. My final consensus on Washington is that it is going to remain a Democratic stronghold for a very long time. With Republicans actually ending up with a negative slope value in their House turnout numbers over the last decade, that just is pretty bad news for the Republican Party in Washington. Obviously, there are a lot more votes cast for Democratic candidates running for House seats 2 years ago, and I expect that enthusiasm to continue into this November, especially with Trump at the top of the ticket and with his horrible negative approval rating in the state. So bottom line, Washington, blue stronghold, staying that way for a very long time. And that just about does it for our latest episode of Elections by Numbers. I want to thank you, the viewer, for tuning in today. If you like what you saw, please hit the subscribe button to get updates on new content as it becomes available. I upload videos every Monday and Thursday. I'm also on Twitter, and I update that account with which state I'm covering next ahead of the scheduled release date. So if you want to stay ahead of the curve, please give me a follow on Twitter, and that link is in the description. Thanks again for watching. Thank you for voting. See you next time.